think federal employees are overpaid and don't work as hard as private sector employees. I believe I
think that's me.
That's you. Begin, Mr. Fimian.
Folks, I don't agree with that at all. Look, hey, let me tell you, in my company, what we do is we ask for people's feedback, and we implement it, and we give bonuses based on cost savings. If there's 20 people in the department and one of them leaves, we say to the other 19, hey, you can rehire or not, but if you don't rehire, we're going to split the savings with you 50-50 for 1 year. Second year, you get 25%, house gets 75%. Folks, we hardly ever rehire. We have an immensely talented federal workforce. These folks know their jobs really well. Their boss's political appointee boss doesn't, but they do. It is time to tap into that marvelous reserve. Look. This financial stuff I was talking about earlier, this is really serious stuff. It is time, all the old paradigms, they're broken. They don't work. It's time to change things. It's time to have something new. Let's ask the federal worker. Well, first of all, let's say this. If there's 1,000 people in a department and 40 of them are trid out 1 year, they move because of a spouse, they retire, whatever, and you say to the other 960, look, if you don't rehire, we're going to give you 50% of the savings for 1 year. You watch what happens in 5 years. What gets incented gets done. And that's a private sector innovation that's not terribly complicated, but I think will work in Congress. I really do. These people know their jobs. They know if they need more help. But if you incent them to get more money, I think you're going to find a very positive result. Moreover, I think if you ask them to come up with savings and you get out of the way and let them do it, I think they'll spin up like tornadoes. And if you give them 10% of that savings, I mean, watch what happens in 5 years. We need to change what we're doing. What we're doing does not work. What we're doing has a bad end because it stops. You can't keep borrowing. You know, it's one thing that the Social Security Trust Fund, this massive amount of money, has an IOU in it, and that the Transportation Highway Trust Fund had $78 billion spent in 5 years on a transportation museum and on bike paths and on flowers in the median. Politicians do this because all they care about is getting reelected, but what matters here is fiscal stability for our nation, what I was talking about earlier, and we need to incent the federal worker at all levels, folks, in my opinion, to come up with cost savings, to come up with efficiencies, and reward them for doing so. I think that's the only way out of the hole that we've got.
Congressman, are federal employees overpaid?
No, they are not. You know, this comes from the top. That all sounded good. But the man who would be the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, the minority leader of the House, Mr. John Boehner, gave a fiery speech in which he said federal workers were overpaid, that their benefits were bloated, and that they were inefficient. How can we be surprised when we look at a national poll then, after federal workers have been demonized by one of the two political parties for so many years, that the public buys into it? And it's absolutely false, and it's a stereotype. And I think we have to remember, certainly in this district, we do know who federal employees are. They're hardworking people who serve the public. They're often highly motivated. Many of them, especially at the upper end of the skill level, could make a lot more money, frankly, in the private sector. They've chosen public service because they, like so many other of our Americans, see it as a noble calling. I was 10 years old when John Kennedy said, you know, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That was a call to service, public service. And I believe in public service in my very bones. And I knew so many federal employees who believed the same. Demonizing them does a disservice. And let me tell you, 47% of the current federal workforce is eligible for retirement over the next 10 years. That means we have hundreds of thousands of federal employees we're going to have to recruit and retain. And I don't think you send a good message when you demonize federal work and federal employees in terms of attracting people, in terms of that being something desirable that they'd like to do. I think we can do better. I think our leaders on both sides of the aisle, frankly, need to return to the nobility of public service and say that.
Yeah. Well, folks, I hope my answer was adequate. I'm not going to return to that topic, but what I would like to do is mention something that I failed to do when we were asked about health care. and that is this. Congressman Connolly has voted for 2 health care bills. The first was socialized medicine, like in Great Britain. Well, and lucky for the American people, it failed because it would bring long lines and rationing and denying life-saving procedures for some people. The other did pass, and it cuts $500 billion out of Medicare and slashes Medicare reimbursement to doctors. It means you'll not be able to keep your doctor under the health care plan. Now, this should come as no surprise because Mr. Connolly is an advocate for health care rationing. He wrote a book in 1974 called The Population Activist Handbook. In this book, he writes about a lot of crazy things, and one of them he says is, we may have to change our mind about the right of access to all public places. Museums, the Gallery of Congress, hospital waiting rooms, and courtrooms cannot accommodate all the people who may wish to exercise their right to visit them. At least Connolly hadn't tried to take the right to private property that he advocates in his book, because he's done the same thing here.
You know, if we had something called the Pinocchio Prize, my opponent just would have won it.
I didn't write the book. Find it yourself.
And neither did I, Keith. You're not paying attention. I helped edit that book and wrote the preamble. I didn't write what you read. Actually, it was a series of authors. And I was 24 years old. It was 1974. But okay, we can go back to your past, too, and talk about a few things. But I thought the question, he was talking about health care. Nobody voted on the House for British-like socialized medicine. There was no such option. I think what my opponent's referring to, not having read the bill, as he said, was the public option. In the exchange program of the menu of options that was proposed to be made available to the public, one option was a public option. That option was killed. And so there was no public option, but it was not socialized medicine. That's called a single payer system, which was never put to the Congress for a vote.